You're in Bangalore, right? Harish, you muted.
Sorry. Welcome back, everyone. We will be now starting the session on India's net zero resolve, complementary and completing roles of Bazar, Samaj, Sarkar. But before we begin, few housekeeping rules. For those of us who have joined offline, if you have any questions that you would like to put up to the panel, on each of the tables we have kept cards. Please utilize the cards to write down your questions. My colleague Neeraj Ahuja, he will be collecting the questions from you and sending it to the moderator separately. And for those of you who have joined online, please put in your questions in the Q&A box, which is available on Zoom. Now, thank you. I'll invite my colleague Shirish to introduce the next session.
Thank you, Gauri. I'll first request our panelists who are present with us in person to please take their places on the dais. Can we have a round of applause for the panel who are present here and has also joined us digitally? So, namaste. On behalf of TRIF, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you present here in person as well as who have joined us digitally. I am Shrish. I am part of the TRIF family in Chhattisgarh. And we have gathered here today for the session on India's net zero resolve, the contemporary role of Bazar, Samaj and Sarkar, where we intend to understand the emerging reconfiguration of people-private-public relationship and its impact on society and economic exchanges as India starts implementing its net zero commitments. In November 2021, as we all are aware, the Honorable PM of India in the COP26 committed to become carbon neutral and achieve net zero emissions by the year 2070. While announcing the commitments, the Honorable PM said, "My words are not just words. They are announcements of a bright future for our future generations. India is not making these commitments to the world, but 125 crore Indians are making these promises to themselves." These 125 plus crore peoples are at the center stage of today's discussion. While we focus on making changes to our energy system, we need to take simultaneous measures to ensure that livelihoods remain stable or rather grow. Considering the disproportionate impact of energy transition on informal job markets and low-skilled workforce, there is a need to prepare the poor and more vulnerable to transit safely and with decent work conditions. And hence, recalibrating rural policies in reaching climate change goals is a must for the country. We at TRI are contributing to turn these commitments into action with a people's first and whole of society approach, be it our work around solar-based irrigation, solar electricity, ensuring electricity in health facilities, Narega plantations, or creating green rural industries. We are trying to bring people at the center of these interventions. Emerging counters of green economy, circular economy, and innovations in the space indicate that with careful pivoting and infusions of new ways of working, the transition may become a winning proposition for the rural communities. This is where we'll require participation from individuals, community, public-private organizations, and many more. This session today will lay out the possible scenarios for work and employment and discuss concrete pathways to ensure that the terms of shifts create better prospect for the poor. We'll now hear from the illustrious panel comprising of Mridula Ramesh, founder of Sundaram Climate Institute, Shweta Srinivasan, Program Manager Energy at India Climate Collaborative, Santosh Kumar Singh, MD Climate and Agri Solutions Intellecap, and Shrashtant Patara, CEO of Development Alternatives. We have their detailed bios on our website, and I'll request everyone to actually go through it. All of them have done tremendous work, and every member on this panel has been a source of inspiration for TRIF for their contribution to the cause. I'm confident the insights that they shall bring in the session are going to be of tremendous value, not only for TRIF, but for everyone interested and concerned for the rural people of the country. I now hand over the session to Harish to take the discussion forward. Harish, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I will as thanks so much that I will not go into the bios of different people, and you just can look at them. All of them have done a tremendous work at the grassroots level and also at wearing multiple hats. And so I would actually directly jump in without giving the pretext, because you've already given a bit of the basis of where we want to go. And this is a kind of a little bit of a free flowing, because all of them have tremendous experience and no prepared questions, though I had asked them to couple of questions, but I might divert from that. And one more thing, housekeeping, Mridula, that if I drop off, if you can take over, but not drop off in the sense my internet goes off, if you can play the role of the moderator, so that Anish and Anirban, I trust them to come up with such complicated panel titles: India's Net Zero Resolve and Complementary and Competing Roles of Bazar, Samaj and Sarkar. Only they could have come up with this thing, because net zero is like moment we have got away from being hunter gatherer, how can we be net zero at all as humanity, right? Hum log usme to we have already, if we do anything, it's very. So first let me go to Shrashant, because Shrashant, if you can tell us from your perspective, how do you define or you understand the word net zero? Because is it really net zero? And we had a brief chat today morning. How do you define net zero? And from your perspective, who has spent enormous number of decades at the ground level, the work that DA has done, from your perspective, how do you define net zero?
Thank you, Harish, and thank you, TRI, for inviting me here. The opportunity to be part of this panel and also engage in a conversation with not just everyone here, but the wider audience on the net. At Development Alternatives, we do not have, and I think I should clarify this upfront, we do not have a definition for net zero, but we do look at the possibility of a net zero economy or a net zero society, and there's a little bit of a difference built in there itself from different perspectives. To give you a brief example, if we're looking at the work we do in building materials, construction technology, then it's fairly straightforward. How do you make them less carbon intensive, right? The processes itself, the building materials that come out of that, or the applications. But then it gets a little bit more complicated if you start looking at what would net zero mean in the lives of farmers in Bundelkhand. It's not so easy to do that because on the one hand, you can look at the carbon intensity of inputs or the processes that they use for agriculture, but then how do you balance that out with what they're producing, or as communities, some of them have also gone into things like agroforestry, orchards, etc. So let alone the definition, even trying to understand what net zero would, how you would calculate it or what it would mean, there becomes complicated. In a larger sense, I think it's both a struggle, but also we have some amount of confidence in the view that the discourse around net zero has thus far been dominated in India, and my guess is more or less across the world, with the equations that exist between Sarkar at different levels and Bazar, but a very limited part of the Bazar, essentially large businesses, corporations, etc. That's what we see most of happening, and the involvement of Samaj is extremely limited in that discourse, or it's a tiny fraction of Samaj as we know it that would be involved in the discourse on net zero. And that, if I could jump to, some kind of an appeal or even a recommendation, that I think is something that we have to do much more of collectively. How do you get a much larger, hopefully the entire society, larger cross-section or entire society involved in this? And I just, by way of example, try and illustrate this. Net zero cannot be about just counting tons of carbon. or it cannot be only about, how much solar energy or, clean energy you could generate and how many people could use that to do whatever they, are producing or their lives, etc. If, for example, we've been trying to do this and I haven't, got anywhere thus far. If we were to calculate the difference in carbon intensity between 600 million people eating a packet of branded multinational produced potato chips every month, just one packet every month for 600 million people. If you were to compare the carbon intensity of that with potato chips being produced locally, one of our entrepreneurs in Mirzapur, is fairly successful, produces Jhatpat brand potato chips, right? Now, if that could happen across 600,000 villages, what would be the carbon intensity of that? And the point I'm trying to make here is that I don't think we're looking at net zero from the point of view of how people would want to live their lives and how they would consume, right? There would be, I think, a stark difference in the way we look at things, our understanding of net zero and how we calculate, environmental and social impact, if we brought that kind of a perspective or began to ask those kind of questions. Ultimately, and Harish, I'll stop here because probably, already gone on for too long, is that the key, you'd asked about, development alternatives perspective or our view. I think the entry point or the key to what we would want to do in net zero hinges on, or it's framed by the idea of much more inclusive entrepreneurship, right? How can you make entrepreneurship much more equitable? How can you get much more people into the ambit of entrepreneurship? Because it's those, probably 60, maybe even 70 million entrepreneurs who exist as informal sector enterprises or micro enterprises that we feel would hold the future, of net zero in India would be determined by those 60 or 70 million people, not, the few large corporations or companies that we have. And it would be around them that you'd be able to build, not just a better environmental future, but also in terms of social impact. So that's essentially where we're focused. Thank you.
Thanks, Shashank, for that. I mean, thanks for laying out in that, and I'll come back to you with a little more provocative question in the second side. But thanks for bringing the whole missing piece of Samaj here. So with that, I'd like to get to Santosh. Santosh, पहले आप सरकार में थे, GIZ जर्मन सरकार में थे आप, दिल्ली में, अभी आप बाजार में आ गए, Intellecap में, in terms of market. So do you think, I mean, and up just and you've been pushing the concept of, I mean, as an Intellecap, pushing the concept of what do you call it as entrepreneurship. And then can you tie with what you want to say is what is missing? How do you have played both roles from the policy perspective and now from an implementation of impact. Is net zero what people talk about? Is it inclusive? I mean, the biggest point that I take out from Chan is that we are talking of net zero, but a lot of the interventions, and Mridula, I'll come to you last, but which we, on the basis that how we spoke about on what's the missing link that you very articulated in yesterday's conversation. But Santosh, is it happening at the pace that we want to go? Even if it's 2070 that our country has put up a target, do you think that capital and Samaj and Sarkar actually working at that pace?
Thank you. And first, thank you to TRF for giving me this opportunity to speak here, and I'm very privileged to be here. Just to clarify, market and Sarkar are the two things, but I first came from Samaj. So I'm from Bihar, and if you talk about being unprivileged, you know what you're talking about. So I have gone through all the three, but let me just kind of quickly add a few points to what Shashank said about the net zero. Net zero, just to give you a very context of net zero is about we should pollute or we should emit just below the carrying capacity of Earth so that we are not adding more emission to that. So while we continue to emit, but Earth has capacity to kind of negate those emissions by sequestering them. So that's the whole idea of that we should emit that. Now, coming back to the specific question that Harish has asked, one is that first net zero goal is so big that you cannot ignore any single element of society to not play a role. This is the first line. So the question about that, whether everybody is playing equal role, everybody is playing the just role, these are the questions we are struggling. Now, the net zero is basically a change in the system, the way we are operating. And any system change, anything that you want to do differently has a cost. And that cost has to be borne by someone. Technically, there is a goal that if net zero is valued, then that cost is seen as investment and not as a cost. If you start valuing that, this is something that's valuable being produced. So you see investment in that as a investment and not as a cost. So that's the first thing. So that's a one dimension. Second dimension is that not everybody is equipped and in the framework to participate in that goal equally. I think you hinted about the corporate's role in the net zero goals. I would come to a couple of segments, and then that's what we work for at a Intellecap or even at a GIZ level. That's the segment we are working for. Probably those who are not privileged or not in position to automatically get included in any mainstream discourse happening around climate change. I can give you some example. MSME and farmers are the two biggest or most vulnerable segment that are struggling with climate change impact. The same segment has no role to play in eating up the carbon budget or contributing to that. Now you are asking them to play a role in achieving net zero. You are putting an additional cost to them while they're struggling to achieve their own kind of operation, saying that you have to contribute to now net zero transition. You cannot force creation of public good by bringing costs to a segment which is underprivileged and the costs are private to them. So that's the second line. Third line is that when we talk about role of market and government and society, society has a big role to play in understanding that net zero is for us and it has to be achieved in a just manner. Now, 2 point, we often ignore the role of society that has played into bringing the net zero to today's discourse. If you just scan the news, many of the foundations, corporates have been sued by the society, and that's why they are talking about ESG and net zero goals. It was not that it occurred to them. So society has played a big role in putting the agenda on the priority. That's one. Second, society has to also play a role in creating the awareness level to such a height that we start looking at the net zero activities in different contexts. So Samaj has a big role to play. Unfortunately, we do not have systems where Samaj can be directly involved into that. Farmers and MSME do not have the capacity, understanding, and framework to participate into this net zero journey. At Intellecap, we have been focusing on MSME and farmers in a very strong way. What we are trying to do that if any activity that a farmer does, which produces a net zero valued outcome, the climate finance should flow automatically to them. Electric mobility player can raise capital at a lower cost because they are going to reduce the carbon emission by switching to electricity. A farmer who is switching to similar kind of activity cannot get the carbon finance, cannot get the climate finance. So one role is that how market can be more inclusive for the segments which are not necessarily a normal part of that. And that's where I'll stop that. There are a number of questions. Society has a role to play in creating the agenda for the whole world, that how we are looking at. They have to bring the frameworks, force the framework to be inclusive. And the government has to start putting the focus on those segments which are not the natural segment that they have worked with. It's very easy for us to create a environment where there is a friction for some to participate and there's no friction for some to participate. A corporate takes rebate for the climate action is a very low friction way of getting corporate sector to participate into that goal. But putting a very convoluted subsidy scheme and capacity building for a farmer is a very high friction way of getting farmer to participate in that. So I'll stop here.
Hello, thanks. Thanks for that. So what I'll come back to you with a different question. So you have been you have articulated it because you've seen all three. But what I see missing in the sector is people like you from Samaj actually getting a position in investments like at Intellecap or something else, which is the biggest barrier. You're not taking, see, we all talk about Samaj and saying, boss, I have a partner in Samaj, but how many people from Samaj actually join the impact investment? That's where the disconnect is. Connect is not about having friendship. So I'll come back to you. How can we get more Santosh in different impact investment here? I mean, that's critical. I'm up to aga, but it's also now for us. Next. And you threw me off with your debate. I was about to come with Shweta, but I'll come directly now to Mridula because he used the word MSME. And Mridula, you also have challenged in a sense the difficulties and how you have gone and been one of the investors in the private capacity of MSME, and you've been a prolific writer on all these issues. But can I specifically, if you can tie it into a couple of points, both what Santosh said about the MSME factor, and you have taken the lead, and also on Pat's in terms of inclusivity, and you been in a extremely what you call it as in part of Madurai, which will not come onto the agenda of net zero per se the debate. How do you want to take it forward with what both of them said?
No, thanks. No, thank you, Harish. I think first you woke me up by saying if you drop off, I have to moderate. That really got me sitting up. So thank you for that. And I'm not, don't drop off. Okay, just put like backup so you don't drop off when you hold this together. Thank you to TIRF for inviting me. No, I think it's very challenging to go third in this kind of panel because a large number of the points you want to make have already been covered. And I look forward to a rich conversation with Santosh at some point in the future because I agree with him and I disagree with him. If you look at, the MSME sector, I think if you look at how much of India's, the industrial energy they consume, it's a good guesstimate. Okay, because I think the numbers are going to be difficult to come by, but it's a good guesstimate. So World Bank has taken a stab at it and said it varies between 33 to 75%, which is a lot. So it's hard for me or anyone to see how India can make progress towards net zero without getting them to play their part, so to speak. And I'm part of the MSME sector, so I think I understand some of the nuances. The other thing which we should keep in mind is MSMEs are huge employers, especially in the rural sector, which is what this dialogue is all about. So one path to net zero is, look, the large corporates, manage their carbon emissions, and they take a larger share of the market from MSMEs, and thereby India moves towards its net zero. I don't think that's a good equilibrium because the people employed by the MSMEs will be out of a job. And in a warming climate, that's not a good situation to be in. So I think it will exacerbate inequalities. So how do we get MSMEs to maintain or grow their share while at the same time managing their carbon emissions? Let me tell you the good and bad and sort of expand on that. I think lowering your carbon footprint for an MSME is easier now than it was, say, 5 years ago, right? I'll talk about our own example of our factories, and we are small textile manufacturers in absolutely rural India, right? So today it's very easy to buy solar or wind power off the grid, and we've gone almost 100% renewable now, and it makes cost sense for us to do so. So I think full kudos for them, but there are a lot of people smaller than us who can't afford to do so. So how do they do it? And we tend to be one of the most energy efficient factories in the world, but how do other people do it? I think there I'm going to put a single one-liner. Industry associations and Samaj has a huge role to play in hand-holding and taking the MSME sector towards lowering their carbon footprint. Today, what is happening is large buyers, large corporates who buy from MSMEs are saying, look, we need to get net zero to our supply chain, so you will do it. They also can play a big role in hand-holding them through. But I think in my experience, what I've seen is industry association and Samaj does a better role. So there is that. But where I agree with Santosh, and this is where the conversation becomes very, very interesting, right? We've already warmed. Climate has changed. It is not going to change. It's not a future event. It's a present event, right? And India is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. I think climate action has to sort of expand beyond the narrow focus of net zero. We need to look at adaptation. And there, the difference between large industries and MSME really becomes a K-shaped curve, right? And you can, when you look at water, for instance, the water footprint, and here the public also plays a role. And let me talk, we're all wearing clothes here, right? And all our clothes are dyed here in some ways. You know, very few of us are wearing unbleached, undyed clothing. This takes a cost to produce this, right? And it takes, let me take a t-shirt, which some of you may be wearing. To make, to produce it, you use dyes, and if you don't treat those dyes, they enter the river, and that river water gets used by farmers or population who then suffer various number of negative consequences. But to treat it takes about 6 rupees per t-shirt, right? But the problem is the margin that an MSME makes out of a single t-shirt is between 2 to 3 rupees. And the buyer will say, I don't care how you treat it. For the person buying from the small brand, not the person buying from Marks and Spencer. The person buying for a small brand will say, I don't care about your margin. So the guy will release his effluent, cheat, do whatever it takes. And this is where I think there is pressure that needs to come from the NGO segment, from the public, to say, look, I'm willing to pay 6 rupees more for my t-shirt to have it responsibly made. And I need traceability to make sure that I ensure it's responsibly made. But please pay that 6 rupees to that 5-man operation, which is dyeing my t-shirt. I think, this expansion beyond net zero of climate action, because if you're not going to treat it, whatever little water you have in, say, Rajasthan, which makes a lot of our tie-dye fabrics, is going to go away. And they're going to have less water in the future, which makes them adapting to any heat wave or water scarcity that climate change will bring to their district that much harder. And I think there Samaj has a huge role to play shoulder to shoulder with the LSMs to build climate resilience, which I think is a greater challenge. We'll stop there.
Thanks, Mridula, for this. And we're talking of dyeing. I mean, you should notice Santosh and Pat, they're actually complementary. Ek white shirt pehna hua, ek white ye pehna, and dusra.
No, but they're wearing white t-shirts. That takes still uses water.
So no, thanks. I will get back to the question.
Harish and Mridula, I'm beige. I'm not white. So.
Okay, यहाँ दिखता है कुछ है. वो zoom में अनीश को पकड़ते हैं. कैसा quality zoom लगा. Anyway, thank you. Now I'll come back. See, Santosh, I'll come back to what Mridula said. So because I think we're making a little different point than that, so I would give you a chance to respond to that. But before that, Shweta, you belong to India Climate Collaborative, because as Indians, collaborative is a very difficult word, and we have our own everybody, and as we spoke yesterday a bit, I mean, what is you have a big challenge as ICC in terms of how you look, because this is somewhere you need to tie everything together to make sure some of the policy makers listen to you, some of the funders make to you. If you can tie in your answers what you've just heard and the ICC's role, plus this word of collaborative, which I've said, I have a difficulty because funders keep telling us we have to be collaborative, but themselves are never collaborative. And so the flow of money, which decides how work has to happen, is never collaborative in the present. So how are you bringing all together in ICC and what you just heard about? Because it's a challenge that you'll have to work along with. Yes, thanks, Shweta, please.
Thank you, Harish. And it's a difficult question because I think we're still figuring out the answer. So caveating that, but just some quick responses and then I'll directly get into your question. So one, in terms of the net zero definitions that you'd raised early on, and also the role that has been played so far, I have to say that even though direct communities may not have been directly involved in a lot of it, there have been civil society and philanthropic organizations who have been quite engaged in this conversation on setting net zero targets globally and to an extent domestically. So that is just one perspective where I may differ with Pat on that. The other aspect I'd also want to touch upon is this view on which actors are likely to be affected the most by the net zero transition and which actors have a bigger role to play in the net zero transition. If we just look at it in those two kind of buckets, I think it kind of accommodates both Mridula's views as well as Santosh's views, because I do believe that there are certain stakeholders who may not have access to capital, and it is the role of organizations like us also to try to mobilize as much capital as possible to ensure that they have they can play their enabling role and create and absorb some of the actions that are needed on the ground, whether that is in terms of deploying renewable assets or applications, or whether it is even in terms of being able to bring in more efficiency in the value chains that they operate in. Now, coming back directly to your question, Harish, in terms of the kind of donors and their differing priorities, absolutely agreed. I don't think there's any question there that different donors tend to come from a very different narrative space in terms of why they want to enter or work with a particular civil society organization. In the last 2 to 3 years that ICC has been trying to kind of map the ecosystem and also understand the type of actors there are, we're seeing a lot of emerging trends even in that space in terms of how you would consider the different typologies of donors who are trying to work with civil society organizations or with governments. So it's not just the international philanthropic organizations who may come with a particular carbon GHG reduction agenda, but there are traditional legacy donors as well as foundations that do consider, for example, trying to climatize their development portfolios and try to understand what the implications of climate change would be on, say, a livelihood program or even, a food security or farmer, livelihood related perspective. But we're also seeing the emergence of 2 or 3 donor typologies, which are very distinct from those two. So we're seeing a lot of these second generation from high net families who are very who spent the last decade looking at climate change and understanding that really directly relating to the problems at hand. So they're not seeing development first and then think, but they're saying you have to act on climate now. Which are the sectors I need to infuse capital into? And then you have a last categorization, which is kind of, if you see it when it's almost like these are tech donors who are very technology centric, who really want to infuse capital to deploy scalable, innovative technologies on the ground in a big way. And they aren't very, their thinking may be a little it'll happen, all the development related requirements, etc., will happen over a period of time. Our role then becomes, when we engage with a lot of them, is to try to make sure that capital flows to some part of the direction, but the models that are deployed on the ground are somewhat scalable, something that you can accelerate. And hence, I would call us like a 5th trend set of these aggregators or these kind of intermediaries. You have people who are kind of raising big, you may have heard about the giving pie, etc. You're trying to get domestic philanthropy to really work in a fashion in which there is untied funding to organizations who work on climate. But what are they working on, right? Anything can have a climate and net zero narrative as in today's day and age. And what we're trying to do is make sure that there's an analytical frame used to inform that. Because I understand that there are development adjacencies, there are intersectionalities with ongoing work, but at the same time, you also need to be clear on the fact that if India really needs to go net zero by 2070, and the power sector is reasonably decarbonized, you also need to look at other sectors in the same manner. And what has happened, unfortunately, just by the circumstance of what's been happening in the philanthropic CSO spaces, there are certain spaces that are capturing the funder mindset more as opposed to others. So you will see a lot more that has happened in power, a lot more happening in electric mobility, but you're not necessarily seeing the same kind of on-ground action in other sectors, which are more on the demand side, for example. The other aspect is also in terms of the implications of the net zero, which I think Santosh also alluded to. But in terms of even looking at tomorrow's problems today, right? So if you're looking at coal mine closures that are likely to happen, not now, but 10 years down the line, you're going to have to start talking about the conversation. Where are the regions? These are regions which have had historical inequity in copious amounts, terrible developmental indicators, right? So if you actually talk about a big economic activity, totally centralized and monopolized by a coal ecosystem, closing down, there are ramifications that you need to plan for now. And I think basis that there's a common thread also emerging in terms of allowing funders are understanding the implications of that and wanting to tag with domestic donors or domestic entities that understand the space in which we operate. Because in India, they don't necessarily know how to navigate what net zero would mean. Even the government doesn't know fully or appreciate fully, but there is an ambition or a unified goal that they've announced that it's by 2070. And what we're trying to do is also map from, backcast from there in terms of what it means for different actors. Now, coming back to the big word that you said, collaborative, loaded word, you're right. Not everyone wants to work together, funders and civil society organizations alike. So what we are trying to do is a lot of convenings around system thinking, on trying to get people to understand their own role and value proposition for a particular common goal. And unfortunately, that is kind of taking time, but there are some kind of positives also that are emerging, because I think we also assume that there are a lot of people who will work at crosshairs, but there are so many people who are just willing to work, especially when the implication is at your doorstep, and come together. And I think our hope is that we mobilize funding in that, in those spaces and seed those. And I can see that the time, I'm going to give you another bit of time for the next set of questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Shweta. Thanks, Shweta, for bringing the other side of it. And also, it's a question that has actually come from the audience who preempted what I was about to ask. I'll mix that first to both Pat and Santosh together. Pat, when you hear the words targets, right? Because people set up targets, and people who don't meet the targets are actually not the people who are suffering the consequences of that. If you look at from a ground perspective, right? He said, I work to another job and I write another proposal and I work happily, right? But the two non-meeting of these targets are the people from Bundelkhand and the client base that the DA actually serves. So when people come up with these words, targets, what does it actually come up in your mind, right? One, and then parallelly, if then the mic could be passed on to Santosh. Santosh, if I ask you from your original background of, one is, please answer to what Mridula said about that point, if you can bring it up, that the challenge that she put in front of her in terms of the SME versus the large corporate. But more importantly, if you could also come up to the jargonization of this sector itself, right? And suppose I tell you, go back to your roots in Bihar, up net zero, mitigation, adaptation, सबको आप भोजपुरी में क्या बोलोगे, right? And कोई आपको सुनने वाला है क्या ये सब? आप जब पावर पॉइंट देने वाला, how many people will say नहीं अभी adaptation में पैसा है, mitigation में नहीं है, हम लोग को पहले इंडस्ट्री करना चाहिए, सीमेंट फैक्ट्री, and net zero आप क्या बोलोगे? How do you translate this? Because we are a vernacular country with diversifications? Are we only certain set of people controlling this dialogue in many ways? But first to you, Pat, and then to Santosh.
Thank you, Harish, and all the panelists. Some really thought-provoking points that were made. My immediate reaction, or the thought that came immediately to my mind when you mentioned targets, was that I really wish we could vote people out of positions of power when targets are not fulfilled. If that could happen, I think not only would we be able to move much more rapidly towards a just net zero future, but also live better, happier lives. Everyone could. If you look at it from the organizational perspective, and I'll be very brief here, I think an organization such as ours is very conscious about the promises that we have to keep with respect to people we work with, whether it's Bundelkhand or it's elsewhere in UP, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana, Uttarakhand, or Malawi for that matter, when we're helping them set up a low carbon brick kiln. So, and that's something, which we would take great pride in, right? That we try the utmost to keep those promises. I think, again, from an organizational perspective, in terms of accountability to the people that we receive funds from, meeting targets is an imperative, right? You're not going to get your second or your third project if you don't do that. I've seen over the last 35 years in the development sector. In the 90s, we could explain away a lot of our shortcomings. That doesn't happen anymore, right? Even if you use the innovation argument, I think donors are much more strict about whether you've met your targets or not. So I think the problem of not meeting targets lies elsewhere. Let me leave it at that. And we could have a totally different discussion on who's less accountable. If I could take just 2 minutes, referring to points made by my colleagues on the panel, just want to give you a few more examples. I talked about potato chips. I loved the T-shirt example. Again, in Mirzapur, right? A person who runs a business, employs 22 people, makes T-shirts, etc., for the local market, right? Compare that, some of which are also now sold on Meesho, right? Compare that to T-shirts coming in from wherever, Indonesia or even Bangladesh, traveling through the maze of Amazon as it exists today and reaching those villages, right? Please work out, the carbon implications of that. Next, ice cream. Again, part of what we call the Mirzapur experiment. Mamta runs an ice cream manufacturing unit. She employs 16 people, including the people who use push carts to sell this locally made ice cream. What would happen in terms of carbon or even social impact if people there did not eat Amrita ice cream, but began to eat, I'm not allowed to take the name of another brand, but one of the, again, multinational or even national brands that get manufactured in big factories and have to travel. Another example, battery-powered rickshaws. We're very proud of the fact that we have a network of women-run rickshaws in Mirzapur that will now soon transition into solar charging, right? And they also not only do they run their rickshaws, but they also provide a social good because they transport women and young girls and young women to their schools and colleges as part of the bargain. Microgrids. We've been running microgrids for now 6 or 7 years. The whole approach is to try and put money into people's pockets instead of trying to take money. And this example sort of connects to the point that people were making earlier on investment and where do you place your bets. Placing your bets with large megawatt scale projects where the whole idea is that you generate clean energy, you have significant gains in terms of the environmental CO2 emission reduction, but the perspective with which you do it is that electricity needs to reach people in villages and the people who are selling that electricity need to get money out of people's pockets, right? That's how your models are built. How do you can flip this around and say the perspective with which we will look at renewable energy is how do we put money into people's pockets? How do we make them earn more, right? And we found that that triggers, not just an effective solution locally for people who've been burning diesel through generator sets, etc., trying to run their businesses. But again, in terms of both environmental and social impact, it has much more gains. So I really think to sort of try and cap this, I really think the battle for a net zero future will be fought in places like Mirzapur, in those local economies, and not in the deserts of Rajasthan, where people are setting up 100 megawatt solar power plant, right? That's not how India is going to achieve its net zero goals, or for that matter, achieve its goals in terms of securing livelihoods for the 12 million people that enter the workforce every year. And we need to look at both when we talk about net zero. Sorry, Harish, once again.
Thanks, thanks, Pat. And if you can hand over the mic to Santosh for that.
You want to hear the Bhojpuri word for climate change mitigation and adaptation, right?
Then और एक को तो ice cream, तो first starting chips and end ice cream आप बीच में लिट्टी ले आओ boss. The question is, so please talk about how do we democratize it in the true fashion so that solutions can get democratized.
So let me just kind of put a disclaimer. Net zero does not focus on adaptation in most discourses. As you said, there are a lot of jargons. If you see India's net zero target, it talks about reducing emissions. It doesn't talk about increasing the resilience or adaptation. So when I talk about net zero, you are only talking about one side of the climate change problem, that is mitigation. Global discourse on mitigation is very mature, very well thought. Adaptation is not. Primarily because adaptation is more of a local geographical economic problem and has too many nuances than the mitigation. Just to give you a context of this, and I was thinking about the two things. Mitigation in Hindi is called saman, and adaptation is called anukulan. Now think of having the discourse on this in a vernacular. So just to give you that, the discourse are happening and there are words around that. But let me answer a couple of things. The jargonization of this space, it is probably one of the very few topics that affects the global discourse on development, which has a lot of scientific and multi-subject underpinnings. Climate change draws from multiple disciplines, and it's very difficult to talk about climate change without getting technical. So it's a challenge that we have all been victim of. We need to figure that out. That's the reason for the thing, because even net zero is not about adaptation, it is about mitigation. The global discourse that happens is more around mitigation. India's Panchamrit is around mitigation. It is not about adaptation. So just to be clear. Second, participation of the people into this discourse. Forget about people who do not have the technical understanding. Look at the professionals who have technical understanding. I produced a report for understanding climate risk in banks' portfolio. They have a dedicated people who look at climate risk. They had zero understanding of climate risk. So now you are talking about that these people who are supposed to factor in all kind of risk in their portfolio have no idea about climate risk, and a person who is basically taking his buffalo to the field and is aware of climate risk, very, very far-fetched. So we need to bring them in minutes. So jargons is a problem. Participation is a problem.
Music somewhere, Santosh. कोई गाना बजा रहा है बीच में.
I'm not sure from where it is coming, but yeah. So jargon is a problem. Second, I would come to the MSME and the climate finance discourse. I'm not sure if audience is aware of that. Globally, the big countries which are supposed to be responsible for the majority of pollution have committed yearly target of $100 billion money to be deployed for climate action. $100 billion yearly. They have never met the target. So that's the one part of the problem. Second part of the problem is that if this money is even made available, how it can flow to the people who are vulnerable, who have a very, very different kind of participation in the problem. MSME, farmers, low-income household. That framework does not exist. You can get green bond, you can get green climate fund, you can get a number of instruments. The ticket size is 50 million and above. Intellecap does investment banking. We raise capital for the entrepreneurs who are working towards the cause. We face two problems. One, People trying to be climate investors, impact investors, but the first task is that can you generate 20%, 30% return? It's almost saying that if you get 30% return in the mainstream sector, why don't you go there? Why you're coming to climate? So they want higher return from the climate sector, yet they want to term as a impact first. That's one problem. So people are not coming primarily in this space because this space is giving them multiple outcomes, but this space is giving them better return. So all kind of climate finance can be bucketed into two pieces. One, where the economics is favorable to the investors and make economic sense. Second, where economics is not favorable to the investors, but it makes a hell lot of a societal and environmental sense to invest. First one is already being catered by pools of capital. Second one is struggling. We need to bring the capital to the second pool. And for doing that, the investors, the market, and everything have to acknowledge that this is the segment where you are putting a price to impact and not only measuring the return in terms of IRR. So this is the point I think Harish sir was hinting that how we are looking at. MSMEs have not been able to tap into that climate finance market easily. And hence you'll see that, I can give you examples to relate to this. Solar story, the grid scale solar is very well financed, is moving very fast. Talk to somebody who is working on the rooftop solar for MSME. This space is struggling. So challenges are there. We need to bring nuances to the climate finance discussion. We need to bring nuances to the discussions on the net zero. We need to bring nuances when we talk about adaptation and other dimensions. Last part, sir, I think participation. The first thing is that civil society should start looking at the climate impact rather than climate change as the topic. Focus on the thing that you are suffering from rather than saying what is the cause. We often get too much caught up into. So give an example. People know that my yield is going down. People know that the floods are coming more frequently. People know that intensity of it is getting increased. Whether it is happening from climate change, that's not their problem. We need to solve that problem. If a person is losing 10 days of job, 10 days of work because he's not able to go in extreme heat and sell vegetable, that's a direct impact on their livelihood. Whether it is coming from climate change or not. So we need to bring people to that level that they start asking questions that this is happening. I'm not a technical expert, but give me a solution. So I'll stop here, sir. I hope I answered a few questions that you put to me.
No. I'm glad you have taken it to an angle that and to a discourse that both of you have pushed it. And I'm glad other two panelists have also made this discussion in a manner. I hope we use TRIF, ICC, Intellecap and PATS organized DA to push, because how do you, the question is, again, it's very few of actually linking between so-called mainstream and down and feeling the pressure internally as from an emotional perspective. Because if we don't do this, it's not going to happen. We're not doing it because I'm going to become, I'm going to increase my salary, I'm going to get a promotion. I think that the incentives are in a different place, and it's just like your independence movement. How do you bring in passion? And plus, if you don't get affected, you get affected. And if the farmers, and I'm now going into Mridula, the question that has come from the audience is two, right? One is, the intent India is not yet a signatory to the deforestation declaration of COP26, and yet it talks about net zero. How can we go together? Are we contradicting each other? This has actually come from the audience. And so if I can tie up the end, and also if you can make your closing comments, because we have 8 minutes, and I'll and the second question is, we talk about regenerative agriculture, wherein the fundamental is to increase carbon content of soil. This will automatically lead to emissions with carbon. How can we talk about net zero?
No, I think these are interesting questions, Harish, but I'm actually going to talk about terminology. As a writer, I think language is important, okay? And the audience is as important also.
Right.
So in my factory, in my day job in textiles, I don't mention climate change. We're almost all renewable. Okay, we're probably one of the most, in the last survey, I think we were one of the most, if not the most, energy efficient factories. I don't mention the word climate change. Okay, it's not required because we pay a huge price for electricity. Every unit saved is, adds to the bottom line and to the incentives of the people saving it. So that is it. The second role I play in Sundaram Climate Institute, we did a survey of the uncovered. Okay, the auto drivers, the house helps, the petty shop assistance, etc. We've spoken to over 2,000 households in Madurai. For 1,000 households, we asked them, what do you think of climate change? Right? We asked the thing. Many of them said, we don't know too much about climate change, but hey, you know what? We're noticing that it's getting hotter. We're noticing it's getting drier. People get it. Terminology is secondary. If you talk of how it impacts them, they get it. Sorry, very short answer there. But I think it's the link between the funders who use all the jargon and all the other actors there and the people who actually understand what's going on. I think that's the linkage that needs some work, the piping and the plumbing between those two. I'll leave it there. The forest question, critical question. And I think that exemplifies a lot of the problems in adaptation. I mean, I hear Santosh loud and clear. I'm an angel investor. I say I will do only climate adaptation startups. I'm up to 20. So there are business models coming out there. And that's the key word, business models. I think, forests are the single biggest frontline climate warriors that India has. Right? And they suffer from two things. They suffer from a lack of understanding and exactly how they impact not just the carbon cycle, but they're critical in soothing out India's volatile water cycle, right? So in terms of adaptation and mitigation, frontline climate warriors. But where they suffer from is, when you ask a very pertinent question, should I clear this block of forest to create a mine? You're looking at cash flow, right? The guy who's creating the mine gets very tangible cash flows from creating that mine and clearing that forest. The cash flow from the forest is neither understood nor actually becomes cash flow, right? So I think there is an enormous opportunity in both, making more people understand how exactly forests are valuable, but also translating some of that value into cash flow for local communities. I've gone into a lot of detail of that in my book, but in the interest of time, let me just quickly go through one example. Mahua, right? Mainstream of a lot of the rural economies across the world. But my research showed me that, an average tribal farmer family earns 5,000 rupees per year from selling Mahua. And because of the enormous inefficiencies of the model there, and that's like the biggest cash flow they get, cash they get in a year, I think we can do better there. Right? I think we can do a heck of a lot better there in innovating there. And that, I think, will really remove the false dichotomy between development and deforestation, in my opinion.
Thanks, Mridula. Chips and Mahua will go very well together, I think, and which I'm sure Santosh will agree. So anyway, thanks, Mridula, for bringing that point. So because we have 3 more minutes, Shweta, are you the plumber that Mridula was mentioning, or are you the plumber who can actually build in those pipelines? Because this is a repeated, because whenever Anish and Anirban and TRI especially brings in these panels, if you look at the background, both of them come from Pradhan perspective and that's perspective where we can relate to what the issues is, but many of the other we see the climate work, it doesn't do IU. So can you be that ICCB, the plumber that Mridula was talking about?
Thank you for asking me to respond on behalf of the entire organization. But honestly, we're trying. We are trying to first map out which pipelines are most critically needed, rather than going behind all of the small ones. We're also trying to figure out where it's needed, where there are major roadblocks in terms of being able to sort that. Because honestly, India's like a country of countries, right? In many ways. And we are trying to look at subnational, regional action to the extent possible. Unfortunately, the plumbing right now has been very skewed towards urban centers. It has been a Delhi-centric conversation in terms of donors engaging more with Delhi-based CSOs. So we are trying to lay out the network at the subnational and regional level for sure. But the other thing that we're also realizing is in terms of even trying to do the field building with the donor community, which is more domestic. There's a lot to be done. We're basically asking companies and organizations to move from traditional CSR thinking of trying to just set up a school and using that for at some level branding, that there were these kind of things, to now moving into these really complex, nuanced conversations while still removing the jargon, still making it about livelihoods, people-centric conversations. And that is not an easy task because it's a communication. As Mridula said, the communications and narrative issue becomes even more important than getting them to understand the science. So I think, yes, we are trying to play that role, and we are definitely trying to also set up a network so that we are not the only people playing that role. Eventually, I think our goal is not necessarily to be that one fulcrum through which everything moves. I think that would be enormously inefficient. So yeah, just.
Thank you. So the last, we have just a minute, 1 minute. Can I ask one last question and a quick answer? One example where you see hope and where you actually see hope, and if people can Google and see it, great. I mean, in the sense that hope where you see one example from your own experience. Can we start with Santosh Saab?
Just quick example, I think the amount of awareness that I'm seeing at MSME level is giving us a lot of hope. So MSMEs are really gearing up. So that's a quick example. I think the other example I'm seeing is that the increased focus on the result-based financing, and whoever produces the outcome, they would get that. So this is something that I hope that would take us forward.
Mridula?
Sorry, no, I'm going to talk about, net zero versus, adaptation. I do waste in water, and I do only waste in water kind of impact investing. 5 years ago, I saw nothing. If I got 1 in a quarter, I would consider it a good quarter. Last week, I saw 5.
Oh.
So I think there's hope there.
Shweta?
My personal story is my hope. I was in policy research and modeling studies and trying to get the government to think about climate. And now I'm working in an India climate collaborator, trying to actually create this network and look at it sectorally, analytically, but still try to get outcomes on the ground. And I think that's also a function of what the ecosystem is developed into. It's expanded by leaps and bounds in the last 5 to 10 years. And I see hope there in terms of the fact that I don't need to just be an academic anymore is my hope.
Thanks so much, Shweta. Shrashtant Saab, Pat Saab.
Thanks, Harish. I see a lot of hope in meso level processes. I think several of the breakthroughs that I was referring to that we've seen elsewhere is when at the district level you have people coming together, and you'd said collaboration is tough, but we've seen it happen, and there are adequate incentives that people can see at that level. I also have a lot of hope around these kind of events, to the extent that they can also become more inclusive and bring a lot of reality into the discussion that we might have on net zero. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Alan. My personal hope is that not in a joking manner, but in a serious, when we start talking about local chips and Mahua, rather than cement and e-transportation and e-vehicle and $100 billion, I think we make stuff. What we discussed today was tangible and something that we hopefully we all can pick up. And that's the jargon that we need to bring into our discussions. And thanks to everybody for being here, and wonderful to have been together on this, and hand it over to our hosts, TRF.
Thank you, Harish.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was thought-provoking and an excellent conversation that we had. A very power-packed conversation indeed. We have covered from defining what is net zero, and the entire vernacular and non-vernacular jargons that we have. And I'm glad that we are ending the session with hopes. And I'm sure many of us will go back to Chhattisgarh's and Jharkhand's, and will have better discussions over chips and mahua there. So thank you so much again. And before we break for lunch, I'll like to invite Anish and Shukji to the dais to make a key announcement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harish, and the excellent panel. You were asking about Bhojpuri. I just recently heard there is a podcast actually on climate change, Dharti Maiya. And Dharti Maiya जो podcast है भोजपुरी में ही podcast है और सिद्धांत जो लड़का है वो ऐसा बड़ा ही कोइंसिडेंस है संतोष जी और हमारा जो जन्मभूमि है उसका भी वही जन्मभूमि है बिहार से तो सही में है भोजपुरी में एक तो है ना और दूसरा जो बात है कि आज जो अनाउंसमेंट भी है वो एकदम सीधा ठेठ भोजपुरी वाला अनाउंसमेंट है कि जैसे बोलते हैं ना गछुआ से पैसा तोड़ के ले आने का वही वाला अनाउंसमेंट है। एक हम लोग का एक सेशन में विनीत राय ने बोला, ये इंटेलिकैप का फाउंडर भी है, उन्होंने बोला कि हम गांव में जाते हैं और जब भी माइक्रो फाइनेंस का बात करते हैं तो एक ही तो लोग बात बोलता है कि पैसा तो दो और ऐसा करो कि ब्याज भी नहीं देना पड़े और हम लौटाएं भी नहीं। तो ऐसा नहीं है कि कस्टमर नहीं है, कस्टमर तो है पैसा लेने के लिए, लेकिन वो कस्टमर थोड़ा सा ना अलग प्रकार का है। So what we have been looking at in this whole, whether we call it net zero or we call it adaptation, mitigation, I mean, in the long run, we don't know what will happen, but we got to be responsible for our future generations. And so we got to be responsible about, issues which is now science validates, and what the panel was saying, actually it is everyday experience for many of us, all of us actually. And so there is a opportunity for rural there, and there is a, we got to be conscious that as we run up to that net zero, there would be losses on the way. And so this is an initiative put together by Intellecap, and Santosh leads that. Santosh, if you could come over, and that is together Intellecap and at TRIF, we are looking to build this. Why don't you share a little bit or we play the video?
We should play the video, and this is just so that they will know the name, and then I can talk about it.
Yes, you are the expert. Yeah.
Please, sir, come and So I think we were talking about the pumps and pipes that could be connected to bring climate finance to smaller segment. These are the pumps and pipe that we have been building. But just to quickly give you what this platform is, the idea is that a lot of smallholder farmers have the capacity to generate many of the climate outcomes along with improving their own livelihood, increasing their productivity, and doing a number of things that they are struggling for. Now, what we are trying to do that, as I was hinting at that, there is a climate pool of capital available. There is a capital that is saying that I'm committed for producing climate outcomes. I'm committed for doing this particular achievement. This platform makes this process very, very seamless. So if you are doing anything that is leading to climate benefit, you should be able to get that climate money to that. That's the broad concept. What is the nut and bolt there? The mechanism is that there is a very booming market for climate outcomes in terms of carbon credits. And the corporates and many others who are looking for the net zero goals, they want to offset their residual emission by these carbon credits. These carbon credits can be produced by growing trees, the very natural way of sequestering carbon, can be switching your agriculture practices, there are multiple ways you can produce that. Now, what we are trying to do that, there are 3-4 concerns in the carbon market. The small farmers cannot participate easily. It requires a lot of technical understanding, the process, etc., to do that. Second, there's a risk of price and investment from the carbon market. So the farmers don't want to get into a space where they have a price risk. And third, the corporates have a challenge that what kind of carbon credits they're buying, they're not sure if this carbon credit is actually doing something to remove the carbon and doing it in a fair and just way. This space, we are trying to solve all the three problems. Make the carbon finance available to farmers without giving them a lot of worries about the price fluctuation. Give the corporates high quality carbon and a way to participate into the welfare journey and their own net zero journey through this platform. And third, we are trying to kind of make this whole process seamless. So that's the goal. I think I will invite Anisa to talk about that, because they are the one who know the farmers' problem and how we can do that. This platform can enable something in the range of 1 million farmers over the next 5 to 10 years. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, that's the intent, to do it with 1 million farmers across board. And you couldn't have a better partner than Intellecap, and particularly Santosh, who we happen to have many connections from our alma mater and to our birthplaces and whatnot. So we intend to build this in a collaborative way, and Harish sir is on our board. He is mentoring and guiding us in this process. So we'll do that, and we'll ensure that net zero nahi rahe. Net kuch iska hai na, mane positive outcome nikle. So this is the intent कि गछवा पर पैसा भी हो गए और हम लोग net zero में सीमित ना रह जाएं. And with this, that's the intent, Santosh, and I think we have earned our lunch. What do we say? Yes. Thank you.